I think you're good there. 1, 2, 3. I think they're good. Yeah.
So I just, yeah, right. Thanks.
The one I didn't have yesterday.
Good evening, everyone. Tonight's board meeting, work session. Call this meeting to order and welcome everybody and we will call the
Yes, thank you. President Vengadaslam, members of the board. Yeah, this one. So Debbie's here, President on the floor. Thank you, President Vengadaslam, and members of the board, staff, and community. Today we are going to begin our first portion of this work session. I'm going to call on Dr. Jewel Harmon, Chief Accountability Officer, to begin our discussion regarding budget and various associated information. Dr. Harmon, the floor is yours.
So we are having a multifaceted work session in our 2 hours tonight. And it is somewhat up to the board if you would like to spend some time talking about the RFP process for a few minutes before or after we talk about budget. It's up to you all. But we talked about in the last work session just having some space to discuss some of that approximately. However many minutes, up to maybe between 30 and 45, depending on what you needed to discuss. And so I'll open it up to you all to discuss that. I have no other information because you all have the copies.
I'm ready to talk about that.
Yes. Okay.
So I read the proposal, roughly the same, but it was clarified scope. I think from a professional service standpoint, it appears appropriate, meaning they know what they're doing. Pricing is good. It's in line, and the references are pretty decent in terms of being able to know at least about how government works, about how the funding we're looking at. So I know it's only one, but I thought it was acceptable as a proposal.
And I don't know nearly as much as you do about this, but I read it and everything seemed, I don't know, okay, and answered the questions that we answered their questions, or they answered our questions, and I'm okay with it.
Yeah. I would say, Debbie, any thoughts?
I've never seen it because it came in while I was gone, and so I don't have a copy of it, so.
It was emailed to everybody twice.
It was digital copy.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I looked for it and I couldn't find it, so I'll just go with what you guys say, so.
I mean, I'll give you
Okay.
it's
Karen is actually going to send it
okay. I
right
think
now.
it's substantially the same. I mean, it's not,
Okay.
they've increased their price from last time, it's the same. We clarified the scope,
Okay.
and they reflected that they understood our clarified scope, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
So that, and I know kind of that first step, if we choose them, which I think is what our next step is, the first step, and I highlighted it, which was,
Performance.
well, no, me fine tune the scope of work, make sure they agree on timing. They have an adjusted or basic month by month timing, but they kind of know what that next step is, and we can get in there and kind of verify, here's all the things they're going to do and what that output looks like.
Okay. Now, just a question, so then to actually accept it, we have to do that in a general membership meeting, correct? Or is that not correct?
To approve the
We would have
proposal.
to approve
We have to approve the
the
proposal.
contract.
Yeah,
and
right,
some
yes.
process.
Yeah, okay.
What you could do is direct us to take action as staff, to reach out to the company to ask them to present a formal contract.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then based on that contract, you all would have additional discussion if needed, or designate, I suppose either board point people to be in conversation about negotiating if there's some details of discussion within the contract that you want changed or adapted. And then, of course, you'd have to take still formal action to approve the expenditure once the, right.
Any additional
Yes.
discussion you'd like to take now?
I think in reading it over, I think we'll need some clarification in terms of particularly policy 6220 and how that has changed over the course of the year, and paying attention to those specific details for each particular year. So
Right, oh,
I think that would
that's
be
right.
really.
That was one of the things I was thinking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we would need to discuss those kinds of particulars at a meeting when we first gather. Yeah. But other than that, I'm good with the proposal.
So would it be helpful then to ask the company, so I guess first of all, would it be helpful if staff received a copy of the proposal to reach out to the company to do that, or is a board member going to take that action to ask for to move forward with a formal contract to be presented to the board, and then possibly ask the company if they are available or some dates that they might be available to come and have a conversation with the board and be available to answer some questions? Is that needed, or?
It is needed, and I'm good if you're comfortable asking. I don't know.
Okay.
So too. Yeah,
Okay.
so move forward.
Do you need the proposal and do you need their contact information?
Yeah, well, I can work with Karen to get it. I just don't have, that's why I was like, is it okay if
Yeah.
now we have that, or ask
There
for
you
a
go,
copy
you
of
can hand
that?
it over, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I was like, I don't, that's fine, I just wanted, right.
I have the extra,
Okay.
hard copy.
Um, So then
Yeah.
we'll use this to make contact with the company to reach out and ask for a formal contract, and then to ask them for a handful of dates, because then that will make it easier for Karen to work with schedules then to see here's when they are available and what works for the board. Be able to ask.
Yeah, I think the only consideration, Dr. Herman, we talked about is during the course of the audit, the auditors ought to be reporting to the board.
Absolutely. That is clear in the scope, and that would not change, so that's why I'm asking about staff taking the, just
Yes. The
working
initial
through the
step.
contracting piece,
Yes,
but they
we
are
appreciate your help.
working with you all in terms of the reporting structure of that.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, then that one was easy. So, Ben, Lisa, Sarah, welcome this evening. The next portion of our board agenda is about next steps with our 1920 budget presentation. It is part of a series of budget work sessions. It's budget season, and Ben talked about initially in that first round that you wanted some options of things to consider, and we talked about values, beliefs of the organization and how they're reflected in what we're spending on. And so this also has some updates of some of those legislative decisions too. And so I'll turn it over to Ben and team to guide that discussion.
All right.
So go forth and enjoy.
Okay. There is a trick, right? Is it on?
There's not one.
Yes, turning it on. That's the trick,
That's
yeah.
a minor trick.
I'm
That's
sorry,
true.
Ben.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good to see you.
Hello.
Certainly an intense time of the year for us. Before we get into this, I do want you to know a couple things. So we looked at this presentation, this exact same presentation that we did last year. And things were quite a bit further along last year. It was a short session. So OSPI was able to update all their revenue models. So that gave us time to, we still don't have enough 203 calculator, but we're kind of at work session 2 now. So we just kind of sticking our neck out a little bit, using some of our estimation methods to say where we think give a range of where we're gonna land revenue-wise. But just so you know, and it's on the record, they actually haven't produced the calculator that last year we would have had for a couple of weeks by now, okay? But couldn't bring you nothing, right? So we've tried to kind of use the team, and there is one tool that OSPI produces that was a little helpful in this as well, so just a caveat. So I want to talk about the budget calendar, where we're at in that, and next steps. I have taken the information that we went over with regards to levy and LEA kind of to the next level in this presentation. So in the first presentation, you kind of got a flavor for what was happening in broad strokes, and I kind of take it a step further to kind of tiptoe into thinking about options as the board and the district confront both short and long-term decisions on whether and how, both for calendar year 19 and calendar year 2021. We do provide some revenue estimates that are our best guess at this time. We get into enrollment. There's always a fair amount of interest in enrollment. We've been very intentional about being conservative this year, given what has happened, and Scott will walk you precisely through what conservatism means in that space. We provide you what we're calling an expenditure outlook. We talk about what we think our expenditures are. The critical part that happens, again, which is somewhat delayed as a function of all of these things I just spoke to you, is we won't get to the point of aggregating full compensation data until probably next week, but we've certainly estimated where we think we're going to land. So we're kind of in between dates a little bit, but we're giving you the best estimate that we can. I was sent some budget options by Jewel. I think they came from Director Harding, and maybe, I don't know who all they came from, but I've included those. There's some slides at the end to provide a platform to discuss those. And then we show you the results of OSPI's multi-year tool, which is the thing they do produce for districts to estimate revenue increases. The caveat with the multi-year tool is they base it on apportionment reports that are at least 4 or 5 months antiquated at this point. They don't incorporate what your revenue estimates are going to be. Some of the underlying cost factors in the multi-year tool have changed over the last month, so depending on when you catch it. So it is an estimator and nothing more, but it's better than nothing at this juncture. Okay. We, as a Class 1 district, we are set to send an F-195 to our ESD by the end of June, and I think the timeline to get it to OSPI is July 10th. Yes, July 10th. Okay. And then, so here's how our budget timeline lays out. We had a work session, now we're in the midst of another, and we'll have a third. We will send a preliminary technical review budget through the process. We post our 2 notices in August for the hearing on August 21st, and then you're set to adopt on August 28th, which I think is a regularly scheduled Wednesday board meeting, if I'm not mistaken. Okay. Okay, you've seen this slide, but it is a precursor to the slides you're about to see. So just as a refresher, what happened, right? What happened is that the voters approved the blue. The blue was always more than what we estimated we could actually collect, which was the red. That's true for almost every district in the state. And now green materializes. Now green is the new lid. And so you got things going on in each direction. And just to clarify, because I understand there was some confusion about this point, if we did not go out for a piggyback levy, we are still able to collect the difference between the red and the blue, because the voters have already authorized that, right? So if we choose to simply certify that which the voters of Kent have already approved, we will benefit from that. The levy portion of that benefit is approximately $4.5 million, and the commensurate LEA is about another $1 million. So it's about a $5.5 million delta. You see that on a later slide for 2019-20, and that certainly helped our cause in 2019-20. And again, that is independent of any decision to go for a piggyback levy, right? Okay. So as we think about options, I wanted to highlight this point, which is this really kind of illustrates the V effect of what has happened with levy authority, okay? The pink is what the voters have approved over history. The, whatever is that, burnt orange, if you will. Is that a burnt orange? We'll go with burnt orange, is the levy lid. Okay? So look how far we came down on the pink and the burnt orange in calendar year 19, and then how far back up burnt orange is going. So in calendar year 17, calendar year 18, we were authorized to collect in this, in 73 up to $83 million, right? Then the big change in state law cuts that by more than half. And now within 2 years, that again, independent of what the district decides to ask the voters to do, independent of that, the burnt orange, which is the levy lid, the amount that we may ask for, is almost all the way back up to where it was in calendar year 17. So in a 4-year span of calendar years, we've completely, it's almost it's not a U, but it's a V, and we've completely reversed field in state policy on what we can raise and support of local schools and communities, okay? Okay? Another thing that changed that was less well known is that, as you know, for many years, Kent was an LEA receiving district. And then you see in calendar year 19, it was virtually a non-entity for Kent. They actually changed the per pupil LEA threshold, so now we're back into getting a little bit. So we're back on a little bit of a yo-yo here. So we got LEA for a long time, then we got nothing. For calendar year 20, the reason it's a dashed line is these are now estimates in the future. But we're scheduled to phase back out of LEA again, given our property wealth, but it would happen out in the 2022, 2023 range. But you will see LEA in our budget in ways that I certainly didn't anticipate prior to the close of legislative session. Okay? So part of the complexity of levies, and I think this question was asked last time when we were looking at this slide, is, okay, you're talking about calendar years, but we do a budget here, like school year budget. So tell me what it is for the school year. So I have tried to adjust everything so it's just last year, this year, right? So we expect to lose about $8.5 million when you combine the levy and the LEA, okay? We were scheduled to lose $14 million. So it's a net gain for us, right, of about 5.5-ish, okay? One of the things that Lisa and I are seeing in the state model upon which this is based is that they are consistently projecting us to collect more than we're actually collecting. So we're trying to ferret out why that is, and that might play a little bit with the difference between year 1 and year 2. But if you were to, like anyone else, go to OSPI's website, pull up the levy playing tool, and see where Ken is, that's what it shows, okay? Okay. And then there's a few slides here I'm going to ask Lisa to walk through. All right.
Okay, so as been indicated, I am going to walk you apportionment funding or federal funding. So I don't actually even have a slide on our local funding, our local revenues. I'll bring that to you next time. The point is your enrollment projections. And then one of the reasons why this model has been delayed is because of some of the other factors that it uses, primarily how they are going to calculate the sub costs. So they haven't quite tweaked the model to their satisfaction yet, I believe, for how they're going to factor in that it's going to be a phase-in of certain rates. So in the past, there's been one annual rate that they use for insurance benefits. Now there's 3 different rates. So for this time period, it's this rate, and another time period, it's another rate, and so on. So there's 3 of those rates that they need to incorporate. They've come up with a blended rate, so I think they're trying to figure out how to work this blended rate into the annual benefit allocation. So that's one of the reasons why the model is being held up. But with that being said, we do have our ways of developing these revenues. I have always created my own F203 model, so that I use that, although this year we have, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Forecast 5, the program that we use. They have also developed their F203 model that we can use. So they are doing the best they can to give us a preliminary version of this model. It's not OSPI's final version, but we have found that it's pretty close and it's a great tool to use as well. So that's really what I've used to develop our projections. And we're finding, I think we're all comfortable that these are very reliable numbers at this point. So overall, with all that being said, so again, this is just our state apportionment revenue. So we're showing that from our projected collections to our estimated for 1920, we're anticipating an increase of 2.8%. So let me just walk you through the major categories here. So general apportionment, which is just how much do we get for our enrolled kids? And that is, so we're estimating the 221.8, sorry, I didn't bring my glasses, $8 million for an increase of 4.37%. Now, to that number, we are applying kind of an anticipating potential impact of us not meeting the K-3 class size level. So if we're not able to meet that with our staffing levels, we want to have accounted for that. So that's why that adjustment is shown in there. And then just going down the list, our CTE anticipated revenues is, again, that specifically is key to revenues, and also our allocation rate increase for those all three of those programs are funded based on the running start rates. So that rate has gone up, and so you'll see that that's representative of the increase in revenues is the rate increase plus any increases in projected revenues. So then just again going down the list, special ed apportionment, that usually comes in two pieces. The special ed, the basic ed portion of special ed funding, and then the strictly special ed funding. The total of those is about 8% increase. The preschool, same thing. We're anticipating about a 9% increase there. LAP, that's pretty flat from last year to this. 1.5%. Transitional bilingual, almost a 5% increase. Highly capable, almost 4%. Nutrition services and transportation, you can see those numbers. So again, these are projected, running our enrollment figures and various factors through the model. So that's how we derive these revenue numbers. So, good. Yeah. Any questions on that?
So I think one of the questions that begs to be answered is about the K-3 piece there. And so we are fully intending to meet K-3, but because we have not been able to kind of fully flesh out what that plan looks like, because it will involve a small bit of staffing, we didn't want to present to you that it was done, because the way the state model is set, unless we exactly meet the 17.0, there will always be a kind of penalty in reduction of revenue. And so we'd rather forecast that as worst case scenarios. We're talking about decisions, knowing that we have every intention of meeting K-3. So I just want you to know that we're not in the process of doing that. We've been working very hard at that over the past month of looking at what that looks like. So.
And what components of those actions? I've heard a lot of other districts what they need to do. Do we need to hire people? Do we need space for the people that we hire? What are some of the components in terms of these actions that we'd have to take?
So it is all of those things and then some, to be fair. I was like, any one of us could speak to this because we've all kind of been involved in that conversation. So I don't know if Mariah, you want to talk a little bit about that? And then.
So the key thing to remember with K-3 class size is, a lot of people think, well, I'm going to walk into a classroom and see 17 students. Yeah. So the first place that we start, and we've been trying to make sure we get this message out in lots of different ways, is to make sure that we're educating everyone on what the RCW actually says. And so you take the total number of students in K-3 divided by the total number of eligible FTE that you can look at. It's not just our classroom teachers. We know we can look at PE, music, library, ELL teachers. We can look at a variety of different components, or duty codes, if you will, that we can divide into that. So what we've spent the last month doing is really ensuring every single staff member who has that interaction with K-3 is factored into that equation, so that we're not bringing more teachers on than what we already have in the district that can be attributed to that formula. So space-wise, we do believe we are going to have the space to be able to implement K-3 and make sure it happens. And particularly because a lot of the FTE, or not a lot, but some of the FTE are not classroom teacher positions. They're coming alongside, they're coming in, they're providing support in a variety of ways. And so we do believe that facility is not going to be an issue, but that's what we've been spending this last month doing, is really looking at all that FTE so that when it comes time to hire, we're only hiring where we absolutely have to do that because that's what's fiscally responsible.
Right, means that we get paid for it, well, from the
Exactly.
state, is they're not paying you if you don't hire the person, but right, we want to hire the people to recover, if you will, or to get paid for them from general apportionment, as opposed to losing revenue.
And it's a fine line between student enrollment. So we're watching student enrollment in conjunction with, as well as timelines for hiring and staffing, and playing that interplay of when all of the staffing allocations are due back from schools. So we are keenly aware of how all of those timelines and deadlines are starting to converge. But we have full intentions. I just didn't want it to go up and have anyone assume that because that's there, we're willing to take the penalty, and not by any means. But
When we think about, say none of the plans are going through, we'll go status quo, worst case scenario. To recover that 5.1 million, you'd have to hire. You get the revenue, but you get the expense.
yes, and then we also get the expense of anything that we pay on top of what the state apportionment provides for a teacher. We take that then kind of expenditure penalty, as Ben has talked about a little bit.
How
And
much
it's,
does that come up?
it's smaller compared to the full hit of
Right.
the revenue penalty. And so it behooves us, no matter what, to meet K3, and we're doing that. But until it's met and done, we don't want to present to you that, oh, it's finished and we're not going to take any reduction, because even if we're at 17.01, there's still a small revenue penalty that we will receive from the state.
And to that point, when we think about the actions that are being done, if we look at this, look at total revenue, increase in revenue, total expenses, I'm sure too, that net change, if we eliminate the 5.1, it's not just net add, it adds
Correct.
expense, and so from a surplus deficit standpoint,
Right.
no real impact. We just want to make sure that we get as much of the revenue that we can without upping the expenses that we don't get.
Yes, sir. That is exactly it.
Okay.
So, but I didn't want you to walk away from that thinking that we weren't working on that heavily.
The one thing, and I'll loop back to this later in the presentation, but the one thing to keep in mind here is that when we look at our outlook, kind of like, what's the future of the fund balance look like, or we don't necessarily look at that 8.69 at the bottom, because each one of these pots of money have very different characteristics. So some of these we regard as, okay, we're getting new money, but we're also going to be spending more money. In fact, in many cases, the program requires it, and it's not absorbing existing costs, it's new costs, right? Versus some of these are truly a benefit to basic ed, and provide general fund relief, as we might say. So a little later, we'll talk about what the real number is to look at, because 8.7 is a number on a page, but that's not what we look at when we look at, is our fiscal health getting better or worse? Okay, we have a federal slide too, I think,
Yeah.
right? Okay, is this the one Sarah was gonna speak to?
Yeah, I'll introduce it a little bit. So, next slide, we're showing you our estimates for our federal revenues. Now, we don't have a tool like we do have for the state apportionment revenues to calculate these. These revenues are, of course, they are federally, they come from feds. And they're more based on specific districts' needs and enrollments, I guess. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. So, but you can see they're pretty consistent from year to year as far as the level of funding. So, but that's how these are developed. We are basically informed how much our awards might be. And at this point, we're still working, for the majority of them, working on our preliminary award amounts, and then they'll be finalized later in the spring and summer. So that's kind of the process. But now I'm going to turn over to Sarah to speak to the specific changes, maybe.
Absolutely. So, thank you for letting me have the floor today. So I really want to actually call out, starting number one is Title I. So as you can see, we're going to get a very nice increase of $2 million under Title I. And so I really want to actually add to the floor that part of what we are working on right now as a school district is making sure that those dollars we just received from the state, we're going to get those right back out to the schools. So part of why the expenditures have not fully been implemented at this point is really because of this $2 million extra dollars that we've just received. And why is that? So I've actually brought some documentation that, if I may just not read to you directly, but just add some information. So the state right now is anticipating that our poverty level is going to increase from 13% to 16%. And that's based both off of the 5 to 17 age range. So again, the state has received additional dollars from the federal government. They've given the state of Washington more money to allocate. So the whole Puget Sound region has received an increase in additional Title I support, which is fantastic news. So I just want to make sure that the board was aware of that as far as that Title I increase. So again, finance and HR are working hard to make sure the schools have received that information as far as how their allocation changes, keeping them in rank order, and then how that really affects kind of staffing and program support at the school levels. Title II, as Lisa just mentioned, for both Title II, Title III, we are fortunate that we get information kind of preliminary already from the federal government that's really passed through from the state on those preliminary numbers, as well as some carryover amounts we've included to continue to provide those level of support. Title IV, which is actually year 3 of that program, and again, we are fortunate to have a full allocation of $400,000 plus some additional carryover to again provide support for school improvements, and then food service, which again, to Lisa's point earlier, that is an estimate at this time, as really those revenues are collected monthly. And so that number, based off the number of meals we serve, based off our free reduced lunch population, et cetera, that number can fluctuate. But again, Lisa and I went through the food service number this morning and feeling very comfortable providing that number today.
Sure.
So when we think about the Title I, what are the things we're spending money on? Is that primarily staff and their association, or is it contract services? Is it, what are the things that we get out of that money?
If I may, or-
The majority of those dollars go straight out to schools in a rank order process Sarah mentioned. So we put out to the schools almost $4 million, if not close to 5 overall. There's also required set-asides where you have to set aside, for example, family engagement, a number of other pieces that you must have. And then there are what are called optional set-asides that you coordinate those fundings along with Title II for professional development, other pieces. So they're fully accounted for in that area. Mostly goes out to schools.
And at the school level, yes, they do spend it on staffing. They have a budget.
Some staff.
Is the other thing, are we spending it on, are we switching dollars, basically spending it on staff we'd already hired, therefore freeing up general education funds? Or are we hiring new staff with that funds?
So here's how it works for Title I specifically. I'm going to share this, is that the preliminary allocations, we have to go out with our preliminary allocations we do for staffing. And so we weren't expecting this big a bump. That bump we didn't find out until like 2-3 weeks ago.
Mid-May.
So I wanted the board to understand is that most districts have to go out with a preliminary allocation to look at the trends of the increase for Title I. So we did that. Once we saw the increase, we were ready to go. Some schools, because of dropping for free reduced, received reductions because of their allocations. We're able to go ahead and bring those levels back up. And some of those schools meant staffing. They did lose a staff in the IBT potentially. The key that we try to make sure we always remember with my team is if there's still supplemental dollars, they don't supplant basic ed dollars, so you can't. So we're always watching that.
Okay.
But it was a really great thing to see because it was timely. Because of some of the staffing we did lose, they were able to provide additional support in those schools.
Okay, so the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk you through our enrollment projections. And one thing I want to clarify is that these enrollment projections are annual average, which is what we are funded on. So you might see conflicting numbers. We have our October counts, our projection for October, which are used for staffing purposes. But when we're talking about our funding estimates, they always are based on annual average. So that's what I'm showing you here. And again, we went into this wanting to be as conservative as we thought was reasonable based on what we saw last year. So we didn't want to base our revenues on a number and then have, have to go through what we went through last fall. So the numbers that you're seeing here are developed very conservatively, and we think that they are really in line with what we're seeing. Remember, the budget status reports that you've been seeing all this past year have shown an irregular trend in our enrollment. I mean, normally September, October, and then once you get to January, then it starts to tail off. I mean, if you go back 100 years, you're going to see that same pattern. This year, that did not hold true. We went September and increased into October, and the numbers here show. So on this first slide, you see column C, where our annual average as of October, that's what that column represents, is the 25.1. And then the column just to the right of that, the annual average as of May, we can see it's actually increased. That, that just never, historically, that doesn't happen. So this past year was really an anomaly. And so we're trying to have to incorporate, okay, what's the new normal, or is this the new normal? I doubt it, but we need to kind of tweak our projection methods a little bit to accommodate what we're seeing this year and maybe plan for that in the next year. So with that being said, our projections for our, again, annual average enrollment that we are using for our revenue projections are the 25,177, which is, we're keeping that consistent with this previous October. That really represents flat, no growth, and actually we're showing, if you compare that to our budgeted annual average that we used in the revised budget, remember the F200 that we went through in the fall, we pulled that down from our original budget to reflect, remember we lost those 700, that's 700 FTE. Well, we even came in lower than that, so we feel confident that by using October's enrollment annual average of the 25,177, I think we feel confident that that's conservative enough, even though May shows, and we're going to end this year most likely higher than that. So we're showing a drop. I guess that's my point, is that going into next year, we will show a drop in enrollment. Now, of course, we all hope that doesn't happen, but, hopefully to prevent a surprise on September 1st, we're building that in. So
Have we, of the districts who also lost a significant amount of enrollment, have we checked with them to see what their enrollment projections are at this point? Not projections, but their actual enrollment is, and is it holding steady like ours is, or are theirs going down?
So I have had that conversation with a number of the districts regionally at the conference, kind of sitting around talking about enrollment, not anything formal per se. So I'm going to make some broad generalities that are generally true for the districts. Most everybody saw a drop, but they saw it in different ways throughout this year. So we dropped, 700 like that, right? And then we had this straight line, for the most part, where we expect to see kids, I hate to say it this way, but statistically, you expect a reduction in the number of FTE, let's put it that way, in the spring. As Lisa went over, we didn't see that, and it was like, what's this? Other districts continued to see their pattern, right? Their normal kind of, their boomerang type of shape, right? So when I mentioned this at a large district roundtable meeting, I was the only one that was seeing the straight line across. So everybody saw a drop, but the activity within the year was different. And that leads people to different projections next year, right? So our year is telling us a story that, okay, well, we're stabilizing in months that we wouldn't expect to be stable. So to go out and project another 700 down would be, we don't have any crumbs of evidence to suggest that that's a thing other than just doing it, right? Other districts are seeing that I want to use a human sensitive term here, but that declining number of students in the spring, and so that doesn't necessarily suggest stability for them. And so I did speak to Highline, for example, and they're projecting another significant decline, but that's kind of what they're seeing in their year, you know? We're not seeing that in our year. Does that make, do you understand what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
everybody's curve
It
looks
just makes me
different.
nervous that if they're all going down, but we're holding steady,
Right,
why are we?
right, that's right.
And might we end up doing the
And
same
we
thing we
did,
did?
like we just learned, like today, actually, that, you know, we lost okay, so get the language right. We experienced an enrollment decline in June, which I was hoping that wouldn't happen because we were seeing the straight line. But it was a smaller decline than one we've experienced in previous years. So even though it didn't stay straight, it had some resistance, if you will, you know. So, you know, when you talk about conservative approach, it's like anybody can just go out and say we're going to lose 500 kids. If you don't actually think there's any data that tells that story, then you shouldn't do it, you know, right? You're trying to be data-based. You're trying to be informed by your situation. And, you know, I think the story that our data is telling is that we had that initial correction. We've stabilized. You know, my expectation from the data we have is that our next year enrollment would not be radically different from this year's enrollment towards the end of the year. I don't have anything to suggest otherwise, but we pulled back just a little bit to be in this realm, we talk about upward bound estimates and lower bound estimates, you know, to give you a range. And that's typically what our demographer has given us, like a band of confidence. So we're in the lower band of confidence. We're still in the range of what we expect, but we're in the lower range to kind of protect ourselves.
Does he or she look into the housing prices in the area and whether they've boosted up or?
Yeah, in fact, I think that was a major theme of kind of what materialized last year, both on maybe less on the purchase side and more so on the rental side.
Yeah, yeah.
That research that was distributed, did anybody look at that? It sort of ran counter to what we were thinking, that there were families moving into Pierce County. They were actually stating that wasn't the case.
Well, I mean, I actually talked to the guy, you know, we had a chat after that. I said, what does this mean, you know? So there can be offsetting things going on, right? So I don't have it in front of me and I don't want to go, but the point being that, you know, so you can have a community like Tacoma that actually experiences a decline in enrollment, but that doesn't mean they're not getting students from the north, right? There's something offsetting happening as well. There was a lot of tumult last year, things going up and down. And so, and not to belabor the point, but the responsible way to do this is you try to be conservative, but you also try to be based in the data, right? And so, you know, talking about another enrollment decline of 700 when you really don't think that's going to happen and you don't have anything to base that on is just, that's not conservatism, that's just, that's a swag, you know. So anyway, that's kind of where we landed on the K-12 slide.
Okay, so the previous slide was looking at only our basic K-12 enrollments. Now this slide is looking at our other program enrollments, which is Running Start, iGrad, and ALE. So these enrollments are a little trickier to project because they really are much more volatile. They don't follow a normal trend necessarily, not only from year to year, but month to month. You could see, I mean, from year to year, you can see this, but even from month to month, you know, it really, kids come, they go, you know, up and down all year. And so really, you really, what I try to do is just kind of normalize the year and then, you know, then look back for a few years and just kind of, I don't want to say it's our best guess, but it kind of is our best guess. And these enrollments are, you know, what the kids generate the revenue, so, you know, our enrollments will dictate our revenue, so it's, you know, again, it's kind of that in and out kind of a philosophy. So, but, I mean, we still want to get close so that we have a good idea on our expenditure budgets and whatnot, and of course staffing, but That's kind of the methodology here. And we've been, I guess the key point is we've been reasonably close with our estimates, so we kind of have a good feel for, again, from year to year, our annualized enrollments are, we've got a pretty good handle. But if you look at month to month, you know, it's kind of like, but overall, if you look at the annual average, again, over the course of the year, they are fairly consistent. So it takes a little more diving into these to collaborating to come up with our enrollment projections, but we get there. So,
Can I add something on that?
yeah,
before we start?
yeah.
So another thing is to keep in mind, these enrollment groups impact us financially in different ways. Getting this right is very important. This is like, if we're up, we're down, there's an immediate financial impact to us. The running start is an interesting dynamic because the running start can impact this graph because we might see fewer students in 11 and 12 because now they're here, right?
Right.
But just on the face of it, that number of the 950 and the 90, as that number is up or down, we're essentially just sending that money on to Green River Community College, right? Where it impacts us is here, right? If we start to see lower numbers here. And sometimes we do see those commensurately as those things go up, these go down, but that's not always the case. Okay, so a few more slides that kind of get into discussion of outlook and so forth. And so you guys remember the thermometer that we, the whole triathlon story and the whole thing, right? Okay, and so the idea behind that was that we were trying to kind of frame options of, it takes a certain amount to hit your board policy. It takes a certain amount to avoid deficit spending. It takes a certain amount to avoid an interfund loan, right? And so, based on the conversation that was had at those board meetings, I came away feeling like there was a lean towards avoid deficit spending, even if getting to 5% in 1 year seemed maybe perhaps a bit aggressive for what it meant from a staffing standpoint, right? And so this graph illustrates a point here in terms of, what is 5%? And then what is 5% unassigned? And that's, we tend to glaze over that a little bit, but remember every year, so, I think our last budget update was like, what were we, 18.5 or something on projected fund balance, right? Okay, so that's total, right? And within the 18.5, there might be, I don't know exactly, but let's say $4 or $5 million of reservations and assignations associated with that fund balance. So your unassigned fund balance is $5 million less, right? And our policy speaks to that unassigned portion, which is smaller than the total, right? So just think about, okay, oh, there it is, 18.2, I think is what the last one was. So if we happen to end the year at 18.2, and actually, as of today, I think we'll probably end up a little higher than that, but we'll go with that number. If we end up with 18.2, the blue dotted line, you see that little dash there? That represents, that represents the actual nominal number that is 5% fund balance. So you see we'd be a little bit short of 5% fund balance, right? But that's not your policy. Your policy is 5% unassigned fund balance, right? So you gotta go all the way up to the dotted red line. You following me here? And then in getting all the way up to that, in effect, what you really have is close to $22-23 billion in total fund balance. But now you got 18.5 of it that's unassigned. And that's a key distinction because I think people are locked into the idea that once we have a total fund balance of 5%, we're done. The level of assignments that go to a fund balance, is an important part of the budget process. So, for example, Kent School District has a carry forward policy for schools in the last few years, right? So schools that have not expended their budget in a particular year enjoyed the carry forward. It's like carry forward minutes on your plan, right? It's carry forward. Well, we didn't spend all of our money in fiscal year 2018, but we can still spend it in 2019, right? which is great in the sense that it allows schools tremendous flexibility. It creates a disincentive to spend down, which is certainly what we want in our current situation, right? But part of our fund balance right now, a few $1 million of it, I'm gonna guess in round numbers, is associated with that carry forward, right? But that's got an assign to it. It's reserved for the schools to spend on a thing that they're gonna spend it for, right? And so that's an example of fund balance that you see that's actually got a little earmark on it, right? We promised that to the schools. We promised that they could carry it over. We show the benefit of it in fund balance, but it has a specific purpose. And so if we lived out that theory of not going into deficit spending in 1920, then you'd see, okay, if we end with the same amount of fund balance in 1920 that we did in 1819, see where the dashed blue and dashed red are? Okay. And so really, we're talking about a 2-year plan, it seems like, at a minimum. You see what I'm saying? So if we avoided deficit spending in 1920, it doesn't get us closer to our goal, we're just not getting further away, right? And then there's still a chunk to go in 2020, 2021, in which case you wouldn't be talking about just level, but additional savings, okay? I think that's a key concept to grasp. Okay, got 4 more slides. So I mentioned earlier that when we look at like how will fund balance be next year, what do we need to key into to look at our outlook? We're not looking just at the bottom line of this slide up here that was total revenues. Where did that go? Let me see your slide there. Okay, that $8.7 million. There's a lot of that $8.7 million that is earmarked for a specific purpose that we cannot supplant or absorb, or per your question, right? And so when we look at our future position, we're looking at kind of thinking about 2 things. What revenue sources are going up that benefit, that provide general fund relief, that are not otherwise just earmarked? If we get extra money for Title I, guess what? We're spending extra money in Title I, right? And that doesn't increase or decrease our core expenditure situation. Versus if we get an increase in levy, we get a real benefit to the general fund, a general fund relief, levy relief. And so it's almost like you're creating 2 different pots of revenue, right? So if you'll allow me to move from side to side a bit here. So here is what OSPI has published in their multi-year tool. And I've organized it by, they've organized it by basic ed, other programs, and Levy LEA. Okay? And here's a kind of a basic formula to follow in your head that simplifies things. If you take your general apportionment, not your bilingual, not your highly capable, not your LAP, all programs that where they give you money, they expect you to spend it on a specific thing, right? But general apportionment, okay? The additional funding that we're receiving for levy and LEA, which you see represented at the bottom, okay? And you, of course, acknowledge and appreciate the fact that we're getting extra funding in all of those programs, CTE, bilingual, learning assistance, lab concentration, but that those will mean increases in program, not relief to the general fund, which is a good thing. I mean, it's a great thing for our district, but it factors differently financially, okay? That's how we think about this. We look at the generalized sources of revenues And then we think about our generalized expenses. So what are our generalized expenses? Okay? We have year 2 of our contractual agreements coming, right? We have more costs for SEB than revenue coming for SEB, okay? So I know you've asked a lot of questions about SEB. So for example, one of our frustrations is that we did our own calculation of how much money we think we should receive for SEB, and that's not matching to the model. So even today, we're a little reluctant to put a number out there because other districts are having to pull their number back. Because there's been revelations about, oh, it's going to be that way. We have districts out in bargaining status as we speak, or excuse me, groups in the district out bargaining. Like, they're up for renegotiation this year, right? We have a certain number of MSOC increases that are not covered by those categorical programs, right? Well, think about this for a second. We started last year with virtually no fund balance, right? We had an operating surplus this year because we're going to end with a fund balance, right? Our revenues exceeded our expenditures by a sizable margin this year, and we'll end the year with at least $18 million, right? So we're going into the next year with an operating surplus. You with me? Next year, the tables flip, okay? We have more expenses than we have generalized revenue. Notice I said generalized revenue. We're getting a lot of new revenue in individual categorical programs, but we will also have a lot of expense in those individual categorical programs, okay? So right now, as best as we can estimate, and I would say 10 days from now, we would be in a lot better place. I am envisioning a small operating deficit next year if we have to pay the full $5.1 million revenue penalty for class size. Okay? Does that make sense?
Yes. Yep.
We went from a year where we had an operating surplus. Our expenses exceed our revenue in the following year, therefore that operating surplus closes, right?
Yeah.
And so we're really on the edge. We're very close in terms of whether our revenues will exceed our expenditures next year. Right now, I think they're less. A small operating deficit, okay? And that assumes the full $5.1 million burden because that is what is a known fact right now, right? We're working on that, and I'm greatly optimistic about that, but.
And that assumes that enrollment,
That is correct, and it assumes an enrollment decline, okay? And so that's where, without kind of having a lot of official documentation that we'll receive in the next week, that is where our collective consciousness is in terms of thinking where we're at. If we were able to effectively address the K-3 situation as we are teaming to do, and we do so in a way that, to your point, Ross, does not incur a large expenditure side penalty, which is like running in place, right? You get more revenue, but you're, right? Then we're in play. We're conceivably in play to be even. That's what I see as possible, okay? All right. I was asked to kind of look into a few budget options that I've just added in a slide. They came with varying levels of detail. So sometimes I'm just noting them and allowing people to speak to them or to offer clarity when I didn't necessarily know exactly what was meant. The first one that was given to us was to restore the staffing reduction by 25%. I think I got that right. So the expected attrition was 65.5 positions, is what I have been told. 25% is at 16. I put an average compensation number on that, be about $2 million. Okay. The next one was restoration of all enrichment FTE at the comprehensive high schools. Okay, so this involved what is enrichment, which is a very nettlesome issue. As a way of just kind of defining it, HR was kind enough to share with me some results of like, you know, when they're doing iterations with the schools will report back where they expect the reductions to transpire, right? And then they shared that with me. And so this is self-reported data from the schools in terms of how they're dealing with whatever reduction, right? So it was fractional FTE spread across the comprehensives in music, art, and world language for a total of 3.9 FTE, okay? So again, I attached an average compensation number to that. This will be obviously person-specific, but I just put an
that's
average
more
number on it.
person-specific, yeah.
Okay, you're less than $500,000, you know, ish. And then the next one was restoration of half of the enrichment FTE reductions. So I just split it in half, right? There's no magic on that one. Then there were some iGrad scenarios. I struggled with some of these, and just so you know, I just put them down as they were given to me.
Yeah.
And I just provided the answers that I was given, and there isn't any commentary here, so we can unpack some of this, but the first one was adding back any necessary staff. I didn't necessarily know what that meant, and I tried to inquire as to what staff in this cycle did iGrad actually lose, and it's unclear to me that they lost any staff this year.
Right, so that was, there was a kind of a precondition I meant to put in there, this one's mine was, let's say it's not really what they lost, it's let's say, from what I've heard, you know, go back to the full size of the space, offer the full hours that were offered before. So it's really actually creating something, you know, not really necessarily reducing cuts, but like creating something. So let's say we do that. What does that mean? What would the necessary staff and FTE and contract services be to satisfy those hours and,
Yeah, so some of these options may not stand alone very well. They're more of a discussion among the all, right?
Yeah.
So maybe I'll just read them and then we can kind of, you know, there'd be a discussion, but the four, I think, was there 3 or 4? So the 4 were, the adding back any unnecessary staff, serving lunch at the site, and providing laptops through tech levy. So, and some of these answers may be counterintuitive to what you were expecting, but this is what I was told. On the second one, it wasn't so much that there would be a significant cost to add iGrad to the USDA meal program. Only to the extent that you add any school, you've got considerations in terms of payment rates or whatever, but that's a nominal thing, right? The real issue was more of a practical consideration in terms of, so right now I think it's a vended meal scenario, and this would be a warm meal scenario, and I think, like, are the students actually physically on site during lunch, right? So you'd have varying numbers of kids on site in an actual lunch time, right? So Teresa's like, yeah, we could manage that. And it doesn't necessarily represent she couldn't put a dollar cost to it per se. But there'd be a lot of think through in terms of, okay, so on any given day, you might have very different numbers of kids there at 12 o'clock. And I understand that's how it is now, right? But she said, she reported to me that it was certainly doable.
I said, are there kitchen facilities there?
No, there are not.
So that,
It's still, to be
Right. 'Cause
fair
that's-
to this discussion, their kitchen facilities are slightly less than other schools. There are no
Right.
kitchens in any of our buildings.
Right.
But they do have kind of prep areas.
Right,
iGrad does
warming
not even have the
areas.
prep
That's what I
area.
thought, yeah.
So we'd have to think about warmers and some other things, but the cost of bringing them onto the USDA program is no different than the cost or considerations of any building. So that you
Right.
always are worried about food waste.
Right.
Yeah.
And lunch debt. And so those kinds of things are things that we would take on if we were opening a brand new school anyway.
Right.
In terms of adding a new program to the list. And so it's not anything that is astronomical, or it's just working out the details of, okay, so what time should the lunch period be? There needs to be a lunch period, and maybe it's not 12, maybe it's, you know, what is that kind of period of time that works best?
Right.
Like other buildings, what menu? So we play with our menu, secondary versus elementary, of what meals are more appealing to certain grade levels and age groups. And so getting that right and finding that kind of zone, and then just managing the waste process.
Let's go understand, like, so we don't have it now, what does it take? Does it take people? Does it take reallocation of people? Does it take new people, meaning that we have to
So it actually took
act differently?
adding some things on with OSPI, and so we've been in talks with OSPI
Yeah.
to get them added to the program, and so the plan is for next year to actually have them added as full USDA, like our other buildings.
So when we think about that, is that in the budget right now, or would that be an addition?
So that's in, as Teresa, so nutrition services is a thing, and it is a budget that's related to general fund, but it's kind of self-sustaining. So she's working through that within the scope and parameters
Okay.
of her budget for next year.
Okay.
So this shouldn't be, right, it's a,
Totally added.
right, so it's all in about how many meals are, like balancing of meal serves versus reimbursements.
Sure.
And so all of that is calculated in there, so there shouldn't be a lot of new add. That's when she says nominal, that's how it gets to be nominal.
Right.
We're planning to have meal consumption be balanced with the cost of serving meals.
Yep.
So,
And that could look like a breakfast lunch option, or that could look like depending on.
so we are actually talking about that too, and there's some
What?
things with,
Yeah.
not fully baked, so I'm sharing this
Sure,
as a preliminary consideration. But we talked about, today, we were at a breakfast after the Bell Summit.
Right.
And
Yep,
with
doing
United
that.
Way this
Grab and
morning.
go.
And we were talking about, could iGrad, although they're not required to be a site, could they be a site
Yeah.
for breakfast after the Bell?
Should be
Because of the
perfect,
flexible
'cause it's a grab
schedule,
and go.
it kind of makes sense, but that's also another way to get participation up and some other things. So we are considering what that looks like and very much thinking about that, them being part of the
Yeah.
traditional kind of nutrition services program for a school district. So it's a plan, but it really is a nominal cost. It's just more about procedural administrative things that have to be worked out.
Yeah.
Along with OSPI kind of, there's some regulations about adding mid-year and how that happens.
Yes.
Wanted to speak to the staffing piece.
Sure.
So staffing did not decrease. In fact, we increased it by adding an EA for this upcoming year. As far as the hours being able to be open for the number of
Right.
hours, we know that the AP has been associated with that. And so when we went from 17-18 into 18-19 with the decrease of the AP, there was concern that they would not be able to have the supervision on staff they needed to. One of the ideas that was presented, and this would require bargaining, so I want to be very careful with that, is if there was, instead of having an EA, what about a 10-month AP? So that was another thing that has been presented as a cost comparable. The reason I say it has to be bargained is there is no line item for 10-month AP
Right.
at the alternative school. That would have to be something we would have to bargain. But that was mentioned as well. So cost-wise, it doesn't really change anything cost-wise, but we also want to think about programs that make sense, all those things. I think we've had lots of conversation about what's appropriate staffing for the program that's at IGRAD. And from the cost side of things, 10-month AP and an EA is comparable in cost.
And I hope I'm not stepping into it on number 3, but I think the question was, can we provide laptops to iGrad students? And the answer I got back was, there are laptops at the iGrad facility that are available for checkout, and there was less than half of them that had been checked out. Am I saying this correct?
Well, it came from, like, we just recently approved some refresh from the tech levies. Like, that's the tech levy dollars, right? It's not general fund dollars, it's tech levy dollars. I'm like, okay, if iGrad, this is not assuming I know nothing, if iGrad had 0 laptops, how much from a tech levy would be available to give them laptops? Coming into the real scenario, there's no additional purchase of laptops required to provide that coverage. Is I think the answer is.
So it's been built, whatever was needed to build in to provide them for one-to-one has been built in. And so that was, as that became a concern for the district, we were working toward that from the beginning of the year. Because it wasn't pre-allocated in the levy plan for one-to-one, we had to shift some things around. And they've had the 150 for a couple of months. So granted, all of them are not checked out. That could be because it wasn't in place at the beginning of the year to kind of get that rocking and rolling. But they have access to 150, and a proportion of those have been released to students, not maximized to the 150. But the number that that team has been working with the principal has been around 300.
Yep.
And so that's what we're anticipating. But we haven't seen anything close to that as of yet, but we're thinking that could be because it was part mid-year implementation. But it doesn't require a new ask for tech
Right.
levy dollars or anything like that.
Yeah.
It is built into the current tech levy plan. And so to that end, there's no additional cost to expanding. And then I want to speak to the building piece just a little bit, to clarify too. In Ben's current budget expenditures, although it would show up in a very, very tiny fractional way in the larger budget, he has not taken out the cost of reducing the iGrad space, because it hasn't happened as an official thing yet. So again, in their budget philosophies, they are rolling forward current expenditures in the current both space. So even that is built into the current budget. So there's no additional expenditure cost
I
to
know
that
there's
either.
future changes in
Yes.
place, so I kind of want to say, like, what's in the status quo budget? Or
And so
sorry,
that's
what's in the budget? Is it status quo?
Yes.
Is it a change?
And that's what I wanted to be clear, is like,
Okay.
that also is in the status quo. So if that were a switch, it wouldn't be, oh, now we have to add back in the lease cost. It is there in
Okay.
the current.
So that did answer my question. You know, it was kind of vague and it was kind of writing stuff down late night, but yes, it did answer the question.
Then I only had two others, I believe, if I hope I didn't leave any out. Other, not to say scenarios, but options that have been discussed are a director of equity position. I guess the last one is fait accompli after the conversation we just had, the external financial audit. But anyway, those were the options that I got. I hope I got them all on.
So I wanted to go back to the ones about enrichment, because I want to kind of run something, make sure I'm thinking about this the right way, and you showed it kind of before with the balance, and so we're in this V-shaped where if we just look at the amount of money we're allowed to collect from the local levy. Way back to 2014, that's when we kind of had our first 4-year larger number, you know, we're here, but say 2014, we did a 4-year levy, we're allowed to collect something, I don't know what it was, an amount much larger than we are now, an amount I think is larger than even the 250 or the 2,500 per student there. So we had this 4 years of a lot of local levy.
Yep.
Granted, it wasn't required to be spent on enrichment at that time.
Right.
So now we kind of went down with the beam. You only get $1.50. It's only enrichment. This is my opinion of whether when I think about naturally what classes are cut,
Yep.
we can't cut core classes because they're funded by basic education. You would cut classes that aren't funded anymore.
Right.
Fundamentally, we are funding less enrichment than we were before.
Right.
It's a general thing. We have the ability to do that later, 2021. I'm talking. And so I'm worried. The questions were, okay, I don't want to have a knee-jerk reaction to add back a bunch of stuff when we're now allowed to collect $2,500 per student. And then add back things that are either one, lost, or two, potentially, frankly, what we did in 13, 14, not we, because not many of us were here, but way back then, we added more staff than basically could pay for in the long term. And so understanding like, okay, if we're gonna reduce now, how much does it cost to reduce the reduction, or we're still gonna reduce, but ease that in, knowing that we have the potential ability to add that back in any future levy increase in 2021 and beyond. And so to basically prevent too much of a dip and an overreaction, just an over-add in a couple of years. So that was my question on enrichment. It's like, look, if we just focus on what a new levy could be spent, speaking of our community conversation specifically, we talked about what could we do, how could we fund music? Well, increase in enrichment, we talked about the piggyback levy there. If we don't do that, then you're talking 2021, you could get new levy, local levy enrichment dollars, and being able to mitigate the reduction in that short term.
Yeah. Okay, I'll be happy to respond to that, if we want to do that.
Yeah, just, I would say a consideration there is, of course, that 2014 levy, when the public prioritized what they wanted to use that levy for, and we committed to that. So a consideration of restoring some of those priorities, I think, would be in order.
Right, and that, yeah, so that's, I know that back then there was I know there's the enrichment restriction now, and so we can't spend money on stuff that's not enrichment, whatever that means. But right, to that point of we've been in the cycle of reduction, and granted, I don't want to spend money now that we think we're going to get in 2 years, but to prevent from overspending in a couple years and kind of reduce that, knowing where we're at, projected 18, 19 million, that I think there's an idea like that we can afford to reduce the reduction, not eliminate the reduction, in order to prevent, I don't know, too much impact in the short term, in my opinion.
So I will add for the board's consideration in this, because you all's conversation around these option ideas would be very helpful in kind of the next iteration of this that you see in terms of what our outlook looks like, how this plays into the roles of our expenditures and revenue. But I've said this before in other things that we talked about, this current year's fiscal plan and what we're doing, and as we talk about next year, the decisions that we're making as we move forward in thinking about the best interest of the district and our students, because we're having it in a budget work session, we think it's about finance and we think it's about dollars. And so we think our decisions are financial and fiscal decisions when they are really moral and value statements that we're making. And that's not a bad thing. I just want us to be aware of, as we're thinking about what we're doing, we are making value judgments and value statements about what is important and can, and what is our belief system around some of these things, and about staffing and K-3 class sizes. And even though some of that is law, is still a belief system and value statement about what we intend to do and what we believe the educational program is in Kent. When we talk about staffing for enrichment, what that means when putting into place somewhat of a different procedural expectation for our principals in terms of you will put these classes and offer these classes in your master schedule regardless of enrollment and enrichment. And that is a different statement than, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just wanting us to be aware of all of our kind of moral and value and belief statements we're making, and that it's okay to be outside, be in the moral and belief system and value statement realm and not necessarily just in the financial realm. And so.
And that's where I think, I know, maybe it's not this slide, it's another slide that talked about, I know we've talked about fund balance, and when we're hitting fund balance, and of course we're always reviewing our fund balance policy, so that may be a lower number. Right, I think that's where we can say, let's not really care about 1920 and 2021 fund balance and kind of get back to that values. Is the budget we're considering is not necessarily do we exist as a district. I think that we have figured out how to turn around that thing from going down $9 or $10 million a year, but then what does that mean, and then what do we want to do with our budget moving forward?
I will say that one thing that was left off of the budget options list that wasn't necessarily a request of the board, but something that we've heard Booker others occasionally bring up, and I think President Bangadoslam, you asked the state auditor's office about it, was about a formal kind of audit function, broader than just financial audit for the district, as terms of permanent staffing. And so that's something that would also be another kind of value statement or judgment that doesn't really have a place in the current budget, but could if that's something that the district, that our board thinks is.
And it could be part of what happens with the audit recommendations.
Right. Sure.
We may need to explore that. So I also would like to kind of understand those categorical funds. I know we're getting the extra money and we're going to use that, and how does that influx of $2 million, how does that then affect our general fund balance? What can be relieved to reinstate some of those positions that we're losing?
So you have to kind of break it, I'm sorry, were you going to talk about?
Because I know we're using in excess of where we're funded, right, through the general fund. We're trying not to use the general fund,
That's
but
right.
we have been.
That is right, that will be on my tombstone.
So that analysis would be good, and I don't know if the Fiscal Recovery Task Force, that was one of their charge.
Yeah.
If they're looking at that, protecting our general fund.
Yes. So, so there's no one sweeping answer to that question, but it kind of comes in three chunks, okay? So there are certain categorical programs where if we experience an increase in funding, it may actually, in the whole scheme of things, provide general fund relief. Special education is an example of that. So because the district subsidizes, we spend more on special education than we get.
Yeah.
So every dollar we get from the state, in theory, alleviates that which we are subsidizing, except for if our costs are going up commensurately.
You
Contracts.
see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So we have reason to believe at this point that our, I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't remember the exact figures, but we expect special education costs to go up and not incrementally, right? So there's a case where we could have seen some relief, but if there's a commensurate cost increase, then you're kind of back to where you were, right? Programs like LAP, Title, Transitional Bilingual, you know, they have pretty tight regulatory environments of supplemental service, right? And so I would say Israel's something of the expert in the district on this, but, you know, generally speaking, the federal government and the state government has gone through a lot of painstaking regulation to make sure we don't use that money to benefit the general fund. That's the whole point of the program. That if you are experiencing an increase in title funding, it is because they expect your actual poverty to go up, as Sarah showed us, and that we have more needs, and that we would honor that, right? And so there's a little wiggle room there, but not much, not much. And then it really is kind of the general state funding, general purpose programs that really help us. So, you know, to the extent that we make progress on this K-3 class size revenue penalty, that is dollar for dollar a benefit to the district. And to the extent that we solve that through not hiring anybody else, but reallocation, a dollar for dollar benefit to the district.
Okay, I do want to ask about that. One of the concerns I have with that analysis is, are we talking about, I mean, we're talking about all staff, so we're talking about behavioral intervention specialists. Are there, we're using them as the study to see if we fit that parameters. So are they being funded for what they're doing, and what pot is that coming out of, like behavioral intervention specialists?
So we can't,
You can't use those.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying, how is the funding allocated for them? From the levy, or from, where is that funding coming from?
we actually have about 5 to 6 behavior interventionists in our elementary schools that are funded out of basic ed. So at one point, principals could have either like a counselor or a social worker or behavior interventionist.
They were funded from the levy, right?
Funded out of basic ed. And now, as Title I dollars come in, it's easy to go, we'll just move them over to Title I. You can't, that's cost supplanting. They're already in a role that's funded by basic ed. So you'd have to take a look at whether or not that position would change. It would have to be a completely different position with a different title.
Yeah.
About how they're funded is what they're doing.
Right.
It's the time and effort and what kind of service or support are they providing additionally to basic ed that was not provided or could not be provided without those dollars. That's kind of low.
Sorry, family engagement specialists, or their specific,
So as we've done the K-3 analysis, we've looked at every single basic ed funded position that's in our elementary school. Who can we count with the duty codes that are clearly stated in the RCW? And behavior interventionists, counselors, social workers cannot count. Those duty codes don't count. So when we think about, okay, how do we use categorical then, or can we use categorical, we have to ensure that we're following those rules.
I think I understand the question. So we are leveraging the basic ed dollars and the categorical dollars, coordinating them so that we are making sure we're impacting and meeting that K-3 formula. So most recently, for example, the additional Title I dollars you saw, our teams are working very closely together on, so what's in that building that's going to increase potentially in staff, that without supplanting, we could have an additional staff that counts toward the K-3, but still have the supplemental staff
Okay.
that the support that's needing the school happen. So we were working, I mean, almost painstakingly by schools to make sure that we did that.
That's one of the general rules around the K-3 compliance, is that because of the duty codes and that they have to be able or be responsible for direct instruction and direct touch with students. And that's one of the other, why certain other duty codes and responsibilities don't count. Even though they support students in K-3, it has to be an instructional support in contact with students.
And only basic ed positions can count towards K-3. That's key too.
Thank you.
So if you went to OSPI website, and pulled up their tool and did the scroll down menu and picked Kent, this is what you would see. This is different than what Lisa showed you for good reason, because Lisa uses her current enrollment projections, whereas they don't. And so there's reasons why these numbers will be different, but this gives you kind of a range of reasonableness, if you will. And it allows you to kind of get your brains around the big moves, right? So we think we're going to lose about $8.5 million in combined levy and LEA, right? We'll think we get a little bit more for that in all the state programs. You see there, close to $10 million. Only about 7 of which is like true flexible general apportionment money, right? They are giving us, according to this tool, $2.8 million for the increase in sub costs. I'm not convinced that that's accurate yet, and I'm not the only one, so more to learn on that. We get some money for the second professional learning day funded by the state. And then the one thing we added that wasn't on the model is that OSPI publishes a separate model for K-3. So we took the results from their separate model and put it on here, so it's all in one place. So if you just look at what they're showing the public, you know, what any of our bargaining partners could go on the website and look at, you know, it basically shows a net wash. If we're taking the full K-3 penalty. And so there's 2 questions that you don't want to get them confused. Even if we're going to staff to the K-3 17, a different question is, are we doing so in a way that is truly a dollar for dollar benefit up to $5 million? Those are 2 separate questions, right? And so it could be that half of that comes off the table, it could be that more than half, less than half. But just because we're staffing to K-3 doesn't mean that it's either on the revenue or expenditure side in cases where you're hiring to achieve that. And so that's kind of where we're at. And then the future big budget planning issues that Jewel has had me working on, thinking about options for the levy. So when we looked at this slide and we see, okay, in calendar year 2020, the voters approved $50 million, okay? As you move forward to the big question mark, how do you ask and what do you ask for? Which relates to the question you were asking about. How much confidence do you have as an institution about the relationship you have with the voters, and what's your risk in terms of spending more because you know you're going to get more, right?
Right, this suggests we can ask $20 million more dollars than maybe getting in 2020.
Right. So I am in the process of developing a series of options for team to consider, but the easy ones, of course, are the ceiling and the floor. You can't go, 50 million and 7, right? But then you start to go, okay, well, what if that 50 million were simply adjusted by CPI? Or what if we were trying to hit a specific tax rate? What if we tried to take the average tax rate of all of our neighbors? Or what if we tried to use the same tax rate we had in calendar year 2017 before all this happened? Or what if we, and so giving different conceptual landing spots that aren't just random, that start from that basic $50 million floor and go up to that, what will be by 2021 be an almost $70 million cap. What are conceptually consistent and logical landing spots that you could articulate to a voting public about this makes sense because, right? And so I'm working on that. It's very difficult work. But part of what I wanted you to see this slide is that one way to think about it is just kind of, if we just went back to where we were, you know, and what the tax rate was back in calendar year 17 or 16, what would that look like? You know, not even going as high as possible, but just kind of returning to normalcy, if you will, is one way to kind of phrase it. And there, we have a lot of neighbors in the King County region that pay, you know, I was kind of toying around with this idea of your tax rate will be no worse than, you know, your neighbors and this, you know, that sort of thing. And so trying to build out a scaffolding of those, it's kind of funny, it's a chicken or egg thing, because everybody else is doing the same thing. So they call you to use your data, now everybody's kind of derivative of one another. But, you know, you were talking about options and talking about how aggressive to be or not to be, and how the authority has gone up, and just in the process of Jewel having asked me to do that work, I had to ground myself and go back to what the results of our last levy were, and how precarious that was, even at the $1.50 level, and what it means for us as an institution to go from that as our base. Now, financially, we're in a considerably different place now than we were at that time, and I hope we're changing the narrative in a very positive way. But still, that's what's real, right? Our last levy results are real. And so it has me in a risk-averse mindset, because I'm thinking, you know, a district that just was able to squeak by with a past levy last time has to think about the criticism of either hearing the voice of the community or not hearing the voice of the community, and being sensitive to what that voice even is, what that message even is. So it's very complicated. I think the state really kind of did us a disservice, frankly, with all this big V shape. And now they feel like they've bailed us out, but they're not the ones that have to go tell the story to the community, because it doesn't make any sense at all to anybody out there who's a voter to go, you did what now?
And that was
Especially when you
evident.
add on the fact, the complexity of a piggyback possibility. So that's something else that we haven't fully explored either. I mean, we've had conversations, but with our board and hearing kind of your perspectives on, that's an added level of risk. So there are.
And that's where that value statement and what is really important to our district and to our community really becomes important, that discussion.
Some significant changes that have been made from technology to whole child enrichment, and we were paying attention to those. That is an important piece for us to consider. I appreciate that.
And one other thing I think I wanted to talk about was this, well, going back to behavioral intervention specialists. I'd like to really see a scenario in how we increase those support systems. I don't think I got that captured in my earlier discussions, but I think more and more that's becoming an issue, especially with our students in special ed and the sports that are going on in our schools. So I would really like to see a scenario on that as well.
Around behavior intervention support specialists specifically?
Yes.
We would include not only the specialists, but community-based partners who we
Yes,
contract with.
contracts, yes.
We utilize that.
Yes.
That
That is
would also
it.
need to capture that.
Overall mental health is what we're talking about,
Yes.
essentially. Okay.
Looking at the scenarios that different board members have proposed, when do we get to weigh in on that, and with, talking with you to make sure that we're not overstepping, but when do we get to weigh in on what's really, really important to us and what we want to see going forward?
I think that's
Summer, I
that
hope.
is a conversation for us all. That it would be immediate. We need to schedule appropriately.
Needs to happen fairly soon, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yes.
We have, summer will be here before we know it. So that's noted, and I know that we'll have a smaller table conversation. No, that's a priority. Okay.
And we also talked about a public discussion before the August meeting, public hearing, having some sort of a
Some,
public town hall type discussion. I don't know if there's been any thought put into that.
there's been thought exchange, and there's been discussion about, we've talked about the idea of about what a town hall could look like, giving the community an opportunity to weigh in and provide priorities. We're doing that now with our board. We've heard from you. We also have an opportunity to hear from our community. I've heard town hall, physical. Those are conversations now I think we need to accelerate and see what our options are. We do have a technology option. We have a face-to-face option. Have a additional
I don't know,
thoughts.
what is the board thinking?
No, I think it's
I've
good. I
already
think some of
shared.
these things are bargaining issues, though, and I think that's a
Yeah.
piece we have to really, and I
Always.
don't know how,
You know,
No.
Whether we're hearing, and I hear,
what concerns are,
agree.
yeah.
Yes.
And just the ability to be able to say, well, we can and cannot do this, because there's some
Absolutely.
things that I know that we cannot do, right? And at this point, you know what I'm saying? So I'm wondering about being clear and open and transparent about what actually we can
Yeah.
do versus what we cannot.
I just think if
that's-
we're going back to a levy situation, I can't imagine doing that without public input. Because I
most
think that's
definitely.
what happened with our previous levy, is that we asked for that town hall input, and we prioritized 2014, the top 5 things that they asked for. That's what we committed to. And now it's as though the public's not understanding why is music being cut in elementary when that was a commitment we made in 2014. So those kinds of things really need to be kind of thought through.
I was going to say, I don't think it was cut in
24.
Well, it's not
elementary.
cut,
Yeah,
but I mean,
it's-
when you have
We're saying the
teachers who are
reductions
leaving-
versus
yeah,
cut.
reductions, sorry.
Because
Yeah,
there were
there's
no
no
reductions
cut,
in elementary
right,
music.
yeah.
In fact, there'll be
Right.
increases in elementary music with moving to the 50-minute model. One of the things when we talk about value statements, and I appreciated that comment, and one thing I would add to that is adding FTE and enrichment so that we increase the number of music, art, world language classes. Those classes would have much, much lower student enrollment in them. And then you have teachers who are teaching science and math and language arts who will have classes of 31, 32, 33 students. As we think about the statement and the value statement we're making,
To who?
certainly
Yeah,
wanting to have
exactly.
music as your classroom is right next to
Absolutely.
another classroom, you say, well, I teach English language arts and I've got 32 students, and someone
Yeah.
who teaches
10.
French war has 12 students.
Right.
That makes a very important statement as well.
Absolutely.
But I think from the board standpoint, our position should be, we want cuts this way, and then you kind of got to figure it out. I don't think we should say class size should be this, that, or the other.
Yeah.
I also don't think we should say restore all classes regardless of class size. So somewhere in the middle of like, it's important that we value something.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
what
I
we do
don't
that
think we can
sentence.
compare a
And then
classroom
figure,
next
and
to
then
each
figuring
other
out what
by
that
class
means.
size.
I think my
without
point
us-
is,
Go ahead, please.
my point is that if we make a determination that our value statement is, yes, we are going to offer more, we're not going to have reductions in music, art, and language, that will, as an
Right.
have an impact on class
I'm
size.
saying
But I
we
think
have
we
Yeah,
less
and I
need
think-
to
value,
I
less
think we gotta
value in
think
these
about
other
our
places.
statements that-
We do, and I don't know how, well, I'm thinking about, so kind of clarify a little bit what you said about the board saying, well, we want cuts here.
No, I think
Because
we
I don't know that
can't-
that's something we
shouldn't
should
say
be
statements that
saying.
are too specific or too operational. It should say something like, we value,
We
we
value.
want classes that have a desired enrollment to be offered. Something very broad. We want music classes that have kids who want to go to them to be offered. Without going into something to say, reduce cuts. Like I put that out there just to get a rough number, but that our value statement wouldn't be those options. It would be, we want this amount, we want, every music class that a kid has signed up for, could be filled, is filled.
But what if it's not, I mean, that's a force, you're talking about electives. So it's
Yeah.
a difficult, it's a,
Electives-
but what I'm
That's
saying
Electives that
is,
can
but
be
what I'm
filled are
saying is,
filled.
But that's what I'm saying, they're choices. And so what if kids choose not to, so that's what I'm saying, we're talking about choice classes. So there's no force move for these kids to be there. And so just like any other elective, and I think there's a variety of classes that have been cut, but we're focusing on music. But I think it's kind of across the board, because other districts we've had this conversation too. It's difficult when you have elective classes because they are choice classes. And so it's a lot of times like jewelry, it's up to, you know, either teachers' programs to engage kids in these kind of, right? I mean, you kind of have to.
Right, well, I was really talking about enrichment dollars, so if we're, you know, what are the.
Right, that's what I'm saying.
Disproportionately, things are being cut are enrichment dollars. Granted, because our enrichment revenue's being cut, has been cut already. And so if we want to say, look,
do we
we're going,
prioritize
our
that?
value is that we want to be able to spend whatever money we need to make sure that we don't cut as much enrichment as we have to.
Right, with a reasonable expectation of
details
enrollment in
which-
classes.
Yeah, the details of class
right?
enrollment, all that,
But that should be reasonable.
pushing
right?
to that side of the
Yeah.
table and saying they gotta figure it out. Well, I'm saying I'm not going to figure it out.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
But I think that's what they're doing. Okay.
No, I think
But I
this,
think
this
that's
is,
what, our value statement, sorry,
No,
our value
please.
statement shouldn't be
Okay.
that. Those were just the scenarios that I wanted to see.
Yeah.
We should go to a value statement. We value X, and we want to see that reflected in the budget. That could mean something like this. Or we value keeping classes over. let's say,
Or
fund
under.
balance.
And when
Or
we're
under-
saying we value, we're speaking from the community's perspective.
Yes.
I mean, that's what we
I-
heard.
I get that, but
Throughout
we're a
the-
school board, and so we also have to we have to look at the bigger picture of all teachers in all classes and all, so I understand what you're saying, but there's also this whole devaluing, kind of like, you don't want to devalue others because, and so I'm just saying it's a balance, and I think we have to kind of present I think my desire would be, let's present the information as detailed as possible so people have an understanding of what it might look like. I don't think we're saying we don't value it. I just think we're saying there are hard choices
Well-
that have to be made, and we have to consider what that language arts classroom looks like versus also what that music class looks like, and how, because I don't want teachers who have overloads to be devalued either, or to
And I
have,
think
you know what I'm saying?
We're also
So it's
making sure
that.
we're looking at this in a different way. We're not in a position of, we're going with the same number of head count and we're deciding what to add. We already said we're gonna cut positions. That 65.5 is there, we had numbers last year, so we've been in a 2-year cycle of reducing positions without discriminating, without, you know, we haven't made any value statement which positions should or should not be reduced. And that we would, if we wanted to, make a statement that would influence that reduction decision.
So the reducing the reductions.
But it's
I
going to
don't-
fall out
I don't
in
know
other
if I'm-
classes.
It
It's
is,
gonna-
I don't know if I'm comfortable.
Right,
I'm
but
not
it goes other
comfortable with
way.
that.
Like right now, all this is reduction, you reduce classes are being cut that would be filled with kids who want to go to them. I don't know what proportion that is of all classes being cut. Could be small, because it's just anecdotal.
Yeah.
But to say that, and we shouldn't make that decision because we don't have enough information, but to say that,
Correct.
look, we can reduce the reduction, because these are potential reductions, so restore reductions we've already said we're gonna do, and we focus on these areas of value, whatever that is. Could be music, could be electives, could be advanced placement.
AP was another,
Yeah,
right,
yeah.
so, yeah.
may I
music
add,
or
this,
language,
this is
all
about
language.
what we believe,
Right.
what we value. If you can help us by clarifying, obviously that's not going to happen at this moment, but as soon as humanly possible, clarifying what our beliefs are. What is it that we want for our students? What do we believe? What we're hearing from the community conversations, not necessarily the events, but what are we hearing from our community members when we're in the community? We will take that information, those data, process, and find the most appropriate way to, again, socialize and gather information, and we will work on our part, which is the how we would ensure that reality can actually happen in our classrooms. I've shared this before. We don't have, as much as we are seeing additional revenue, we don't have an infinite amount of resources. We know that. So part of our conversation will begin with our community, helping them, and this is, if you can just envision these two images. For our families who may want what they believe they want for our children, and we agree. Some believe that the image of a top hat and a magic wand is our solution, that we have a infinite amount of money to make that happen. We don't. We have to problem solve. And the other image I would ask you to keep in mind is the Rubik's Cube. So at some point, we're going to have to make some tough decisions, but we're going to process that. It's going to be complex. At the end of the day, what I'm hearing is a very different conversation. Let's go back to 2014. Now, I know where I was in 2014, but I also am reminded of what some of those realities were in 2014.
Right.
And 2014 versus 2019,
Right.
I have heard fundamental shifts in priorities of what our families are wanting, not everyone, but a vast majority of what they would like to see for their students, for our students and their children happening in our schools. So if that's something that again, you'd be able to do for us or help clarify, that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, and I would encourage our community to come out, speak about what's important
Sure.
to them, because I think that's how we make decisions. It's not just the board making decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we have to be really cognizant of
Yes.
that, you know.
That's a part of it.
So Maya, if I could also add, I agree with what Denise was saying, and I also agree that we need to have our community involved in that. But I think we also have to be cognizant to make sure that we're truly getting the voices of our broad community and not just hearing voices of a smaller pool. And I think sometimes that's really hard to do, but making sure, I'm reminded of a time a few years back when we were looking at cuts and we were looking at cutting a program, and we had lots and lots of people that came, and it happened to be a sports program that really only impacted a very small number of students, but yet we packed the boardroom on that particular topic multiple times. And so I think that's as a board, that's one thing that we really need to be cognizant of making sure that we're hearing from everybody. And I really struggle when I see enrichment with music and art, because I don't think they're necessarily enrichment. I really think they're things that are crucial to our students' success in life. And so, but finding that balance, and I think as we go through and look at what our value statement is and how we value and what education means for us looking forward, that'll be something to take into consideration.
Yeah, and as I said, I'm encouraging the community to come out, talk about whatever it is that is on their mind, that's important to them. Because yes, we do hear from a core group of people about music and arts, but I know there are other important issues. But that is a way for us to make decisions as a board. So I think it's an important element of this budget planning. So hopefully we'll get that, but we need to encourage that as well.
There are a few other smaller items that have been talked a little bit about bargaining, and there are a few open negotiations, yes, that will have small impact on 1920 salaries. And then meeting our 24 credit graduation requirements. As that committee has started their work, we do have a budget tab that is blank, and so we've talked about that doesn't mean that there's infinite possibilities in terms of options, but that we will have to develop a plan that is within reasonable fiscal operations, and we haven't, set a number to what that is or a parameter around that space. But they know, these are stakeholders, community members in Kent, so they know that funding is not infinite for that. We also will engage in working with and looking at what it has cost other districts to implement some of those programs, but it will not be absolutely cost neutral and free, because even if there's nothing that PD needed to implement, that still comes at a cost as well. So there's that piece. And then of course there's some nominal costs with opening a new school when it comes to what that administrative staff looks like, and contractual obligations with moving and some other pieces that go along with that as well too. And then every time we talk about opening a new school and what to do there's some boundary work. It doesn't just happen by magic, and there is a cost to having a company come in and not so much facilitate the discussions with the community, but actually draw the maps and engage in that work.
Do we have timelines? Is it going to be a future presentation on the boundary study? And
It's a part of our facilities. We'll need to, it's not a presentation yet, but that will be coming.
okay.
Yeah. Talk about a new school until we get our boundaries.
Yeah.
So as a recap, we have 10 minutes left in the session, but I don't think it's fair to engage in a policy conversation with 10 minutes left. So I just want to recap what I heard so that when we go back as a team to talk and the staff go back to do this work and bring you another iteration, that we're clear on what we're bringing back. And so I did hear that the board would like a space to converse about a few additional possible options. I did hear about an interest in some social emotional, but also behavioral intervention supports for students. I hear that there is a continued interest in looking at what the reduction of reductions looks like. And then we as a team then have to start thinking about what that looks like when it's operationalized and lived, if that comes to be. And so is there anything that I maybe missed or didn't hear? Because I don't want us to, as time marches on, not that you have to know all of the things you want to add, but I just don't want to miss anything that we've discussed tonight when it's time to come back.
Realistically, what's our, not the word timeline, but I'm looking at having that discussion for what our value priorities and what we want to see added into the budget. Do we have to have that before the end of June?
Definitely.
Or June 10th?
Yeah, so we do some kind of backward planning here.
Yeah, we can do that and communicate with our board, but if we think about some of the dates, thank you, Ben, go ahead.
So, you know, we electronically transmit the technical review budget to PSCSD at the end of June. So you have on your calendar a work session for the 26th. Now, I would defer to the boss here, but I would say, you know, like transacting information, not waiting to come together on the 26th, but not everything needs a work session, right? So transacting information earlier rather than later would really help us. Because it's hard to change, like I said, I've never gone through this particular process, but once you send it for technical review, I think it's difficult to make changes to that when you adopt it in August. It's not legally impossible, but since we adopt at the very end, we don't give ourselves a lot of space, right? So I think we had this last year. Yeah, I would just sooner rather than later is my input.
I think our goal as a team, even outside of the submission deadline with F-195, is that when we come back to you on the 26th, we're bringing you something that looks more finalized, formalized, and encompasses quite a bit of what we're hearing is more solidified belief statements, even though they're not necessarily formal belief statements that we can say to the world. They are associated with some dollars that we can incorporate into a budget. And so if there are other things like that that we can start to incorporate, then you all can still have continued conversations about what is the formal statement around this dollar amount that we would like allocated to this idea. And having that before the 26th, so we could at least say, here's what we believe this thing will cost. And now you figure out what the board message is, and we'll figure out how to operationalize that, and then it can get sent to OSPI.
So if one of our priorities is to maintain the size of the space of iGrad, are they supposed to be out of there by June 30th? Or no, they're going to be open through July.
I don't think that, I have to look at the lease date, but I don't think it's June 30th. It's not at the end of the lease. I can get the exact dates for you, but I don't believe it's
25 days.
Okay.
But we'll check on that. But again, that's why it's important for us to know what those, if you've already listed it as a priority, or to rephrase that, so that we can process that well before the 26th will be here before we know it. And we need to make some decisions before then.
So
Karen?
does that mean we're going to be getting together before the 26th? Is that what I'm hearing? Because I mean, if you're just doing two on one or one-on-one or whatever, you're still not going to get the minds together to think about it.
several options that can occur between you are communicating with one another. We can set up 2x2s. We can certainly set up communication with Karen as with a Y, as we have in the past. But there are options, I will say that. So we can also set up a special meeting. I know that we are running on fumes this time of year. At the same time, this is important work. It's also urgent work, and so that brings the priority up. So between Karen and I and team, we'll work with you and have that conversation about what works best. But I would start, again, those ideas that we're speaking about tonight. Don't hesitate to share those with us so we can keep this ongoing list. Then we also have to keep in mind having this conversation, comparing what you are sharing with our community. And that's another conversation. How we do that is also another challenge and opportunity, whether it's face-to-face and blended through technology. Those are all options that are available to us, but again, we need to make those decisions very quickly. Other thoughts? Not this time.
Debbie, anything else?
I
No, I'm good.
I do want to say regarding policy, not this, but we do need to discuss the 1201 because we have to determine that by 26th. So
1210 was actually it's 1210, and it was the only one that was gonna be on there tonight. And if there was time, then it would be 60-22, which is fund balance.
Yeah.
And so our next policy session on the 19th is when it's scheduled. That is also a flexible date for some other things. And, but if we use that date, I would say that I would like to hold at least 30 minutes to flesh out policy 1210, if we don't do anything else.
Okay.
With policy work. So I'm saying that it is on the agenda, it's not falling off, it's not gonna get lost, but.
I think we've added something else to the night.
Well, I think just there are only going to be 2 board members here who are going to be there in December. And so one of the things I wanted to consider is kind of extend, not redo 1210, but extend 1210 dates up until after election.
Yeah, after the elections.
So there's some flexibility of that in the policy until we can talk, in WAS's model, so we can talk about what that looks like.
Yeah.
But it won't get lost before the year ends, so I'm saying that it will be there and it will be done, it is in the mix and it's.
Thank you.
So it didn't get lost.
All right, yeah. Great. Right, so, no other questions? We are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Ben and team, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well done. Thank you.
We are now going into an executive session. It's approximately half an hour. Oh,
Yeah. I missed that. Yesterday.
4 hours.
Yeah, I don't think I saw anything yesterday.
Absolutely. And there's no way we could have that conversation.
Okay,
without
okay.
that. Yeah.
Okay, we just have to do that.